It's 6 o'clock. Can we start with Mr. Brajesh?
Yeah, sure.
Good evening. A warm welcome to all of you to the webinar series hosted by Advocates Association Bengaluru. We have with us today Mr. Brajesh Singh, Advocate. Mr. Brajesh, we are very happy to have you with us today. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Vikram.
Yeah, now I would like to introduce Mr. Brajesh to our viewers. Mr. Brajesh Singh obtained his law degree from University Law College, Bangalore, and his master degree from Bangalore University. He is the founder partner of Advocates Adroit law firm located in Bangalore. He has been practicing on civil law, commercial law, corporate law, IP law, real estate law, aviation law, and many more branches of law. Mr. Brajesh is an avid reader, quizzer, and debater, and has represented Bangalore University in the inter-university debate competition. He is also a convener of the Society of Motors at University Law College, Bangalore. Mr. Brajesh, on behalf of Advocates Association Bangalore, I extend you a very warm welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Vikram. It's indeed a privilege for me to address the advocates on behalf of the Advocates Association of Bangalore. It's been a great benefit for all the advocates, not only of Bangalore, but all legal practitioners as well, who have been following the webinar series which have been organized by the Advocates Association. Very informative, and we can draw upon the vast knowledge and experience of so many advocates who are experts in their own fields. And then we have learned a lot over the past few weeks when these seminars have been going on. And I feel honored to be part of this series of webinars. So to start with, I think we'll need to rewind a few years back, more than a few years back actually, before the 2013 Companies Act came into being and before the NCLT was actually constituted. I think people who've been practicing law in our country over the past even 10 years from now, they'll all remember that if at all a client came to us saying that they wanted to recover money from a company, without batting an eyelid, we'd probably have said that the most efficient way of doing it is to file a winding up petition against the company in the High Court, in the respective High Court where the company is registered. The greatest benefit that the client would have derived from this is that one is that the court fee was very, very negligible compared to what would have to be paid in civil proceedings as such. Because civil proceedings, as you know, if we have to file a recovery suit before a civil court, or if it's an admitted that if we have to file a summary suit before a court of competent jurisdiction, there's a huge amount of money that needs to be paid upfront in the form of court fees. Now, for creditors of the company who have already spent money or who already need to get money from the company, paying for court fees, apart from paying the lawyer's fees as well, which many clients very grudgingly pay, is something that is more of an extra burden. And therefore, the best way that or the most efficient, cost-effective way of recovering money from a company right from the beginning, even when I started practice, was we'd advise that let's file a petition for winding up the company that will persuade the company to settle the matter. And most of the time, that is what used to happen as well. Only in extreme cases where the company was in fact not solvent, and then the company was not in a position at all to clear any of its debts, did the matter actually go beyond the admission stage in the High Court. And then the matter had to be admitted, liquidator would be appointed, assets would be liquidated. But even then, there were chances that during the process of liquidation itself, the dues which would have to be paid by the company to the creditors would be settled by the company as such. Now, this is something that was taken note of by the judiciary as well as the other branches of the government, because the provisions were winding up, which were part of the Companies Act. The intention of inserting those provisions was not to use it as a means for recovering money from a company, from a delinquent company as such. Instead, there were provisions which had to be employed only when there was dire necessity to do that. Only when the company was not functioning in a manner which was in favor of public interest, or when it was deliberately trying to avoid payment of its dues, so on and so forth. When it is not working in a legal manner, it was indulging something that's illegal. That is what was contemplated at the point of time when these provisions were inserted in the Companies Act. But then what had happened was, due to the kind of time and the time of the kind of resources that would need to be spent for recovering the monies which were due from companies, if we have to go before a civil court, people normally gravitated towards winding up petitions before the high courts of the respective states where these companies were registered. And most of the time, we did succeed in getting the money back from the company. And this is how it went on. Now, one thing that was noticed during these proceedings was that the scope for the process being conciliatory in nature was very less, in the sense that once the petition got admitted, it was more or less in the hands of the liquidator who would be appointed by the court. And it was the liquidator who would decide the debts of the company, how the assets would have to be liquidated, how the debts have to be distributed. He would decide on the claims that were received by him once the matter was admitted and it was advertised, and claims were invited from members of the general public as such. So the scope for conciliation was very, very less. And this was one of the factors that was kept in mind when they envisaged the IBC, that is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And they tried to make the process very conciliatory in nature, in the sense that they did not, from the very beginning, even when the winding up provisions were inserted in the Companies Act, it was always contemplated that the existence of the company itself would be called into question only in extreme cases. And so far as possible, they tried to salvage whatever was left of the company and then try to continue that as a going concern. And keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind the fact that the process of making the company, bringing the company back to life, would have to be something conciliatory in nature, wherein not only the company as such, not only the interests of the company, but the interests of the other creditors would also have to be taken into account. They passed the IBC, that is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and a process was brought to life wherein a committee of creditors would be formed, and they, in consultation with the IRP, a professional who was trained in these processes, insolvency resolution professional, these people would sit together and then they decide the fate of the company. It was also left open for the directors of the company to also propose a scheme for bringing the company back to life by returning the debts of the company, by basically clearing whatever dues were to be given to the company, or at least making a proposal on how they would bring the company back to life. So this is how it was going on, and this is how it is in fact still going on. Now, what has happened is that once the lockdowns were announced, starting from the first lockdown in the month of March, on the 25th of March, like we have seen in all other sectors, the economic sector has taken a huge blow. And in fact, those people who are solely dependent on economic activities, it's become a question of survival for most of these entities, including companies, which are all covered under the IBC. Companies as well as partnerships, proprietary concerns, basically all kinds of businesses who rely solely upon whatever business they conduct their profits have seen a huge hit. Not only their profits, but their survival itself has been seen to be at stake. So what the government did in all its wisdom is that it felt that there would be a huge spike in the number of claims that would be made against these companies for defaulting. For defaulting not only against operational creditors. Operational creditors are those creditors to whom money becomes due by the company during the course of its business. For whatever business dealings that they have with these people, it could be for supplies that have been affected by these operational creditors to the company, for services which have been provided, so on and so forth, as well as from financial creditors. Financial creditors are those entities which directly fund the company by infusing liquidity into the company to conduct their business as such. So it was not only foreseen, but it was apparent, it was obvious that such claims would see a huge spike because of the huge economic impact that these lockdowns have had on the economic activity in the country. And therefore, on the 5th of June 2020, the government came up with this ordinance. So what did the ordinance say? It was named as the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Amendment Ordinance of 2020. So what it said was, Section 7, Section 9, and Section 10 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code would be suspended. Now, essentially, what this meant was that whatever proceedings would be, whatever claims would be made, and applications would be filed by operational creditors as well as financial creditors before the NCLT would not be entertained as such. And the ordinance also gave a date, that is the 25th of March 2020, and it said that no claims or no applications in respect of initiating insolvency resolution proceedings against companies for defaults which have occurred on or after 25th of March 2020 for a period of 6 months or such period not exceeding 1 year from such date, as may be notified in this behalf. Such applications would not be entertained at all. So this was done by inserting a new provision within the IBC. That is Section 10A that was inserted. There was also another section that was inserted, that is Section 63, subsection 66, subsection 3, which said that applications cannot be filed by the insolvency resolution professional for such defaults as have been explained in Section 10A. Now, what Section 66(2) talks about is talks about the power of the insolvency resolution professional to call upon the directors to contribute personally to the assets of the company. So essentially, what the government wanted to do was, it wanted to protect the interest of these business houses who were affected drastically by the lockdown. And what is contemplated was that it is obvious that there'd be a lot of defaults that would take place beginning from 25th of March 2020, that is when the lockdown was affected, up to a period of at least 6 months. And there's also a provision made within the ordinance itself that it can also be extended, if so notified, for a period of 1 year thereon. Not only this, but there have also been other notifications which have been issued by the RBI itself, which talk about how NPAs would not, how payments which are due by companies to banks would not be, there'd be a moratorium in creating these NPAs for defaults which have been committed in this particular period as such, essentially pushing the time for that as well by a further period of 3 months. So that is what has happened. So what we see is that the normal mode of recovery that would have been employed by a creditor in the course of business, that would be most efficacious from the point of view of the creditor, be it an operational creditor or a financial creditor, that of invoking that of filing application for insolvency resolution before the NCLT, that is being suspended for a period of 6 months. There are, however, certain ambiguities which we see in this particular ordinance. Now, what is the first ambiguity that we see? The first ambiguity that we see is in this in the ordinance. What they say is that no application for initiation of corporate insolvency shall be filed for a default arising on or after 25th of March 2020 for a period of 6 months or such further period not exceeding 1 year from that date, as may be notified in this behalf. So the first thing, the first ambiguity is with respect to the date that they are talking about. They say that such further period not exceeding 1 year from such date as may be notified in this behalf. Now, if the date that they mention that they refer to is the 25th of March 2020 itself, the clause that follows this, that is as may be notified in this behalf, that itself is redundant, because it would be understood that they're referring to this date itself. Otherwise, if they want to refer to a specific date, such date as may be notified in this behalf, that would leave the ordinance open for it to be extended at any future point of time. Now we know that under under Article 123 of the Constitution, when an ordinance is issued, the life of the ordinance is limited. The ordinance has to be enacted as law by bringing it before the houses of the Parliament within 2 weeks from the next session, which begins after the ordinance has been passed. Now, the minimum amount of time, the maximum amount of time that the Parliament can be without session would be 6 months. And given the conditions, we don't even know whether we'll have a monsoon session or not. We'll have a sitting monsoon session or not. But then, given the fact that there's bound to be a session sometime at least after September or October, we know that the ordinance is going to stay for a set amount of time. It may or it may not survive after October or November. There is also a possibility that once the session sits, once the Parliament session starts, this ordinance which has been passed may not become law at all. And why is that? Is because of the proviso which is there, which has been added to this ordinance. So what does the proviso say? The proviso says that provided that no application shall ever be filed for initiation of corporate insolvency resolution process of a corporate debtor for the said default occurring during the said period. So the specific word that has to be watched out for here is that no application shall ever be filed. So in effect, what it says is that if at all there is a default committed during this period, that is from March 25th, 2020 to the 24th
Did we lose the connection, Akash?
Looks like there is some network issue from him.
I'll just.
Can you please call him and ask?
Yeah, I'll just try to do that. Just hang on for a moment. There's some network issue, so the laptop got logged off, so he will be logging in. Laptop,
Okay,
just
okay.
wait for 2 more minutes. Okay, just try to check if Mr. Brajesh is trying to log
Yeah,
in.
I'm checking. I think he's still joining.
Akash, can you please check in the other list? He's telling me that he's logging in. So can you just
He's
have a
not
check?
yet there actually in the attendee list.
And
So with
I'm
the
not able
same
to
name,
see that.
has he joined?
Yeah, he's trying to join with the same name, same ID. It's just that the laptop got switched off. Now he's restarted and he's trying to log in with the same user.
Yeah, he is there. I'll just add him.
Yes. All right. I think now he's on the panel, right?
Yeah, he's there on the panel, and I think it's taking some time.
All right. Yes.
Okay. So am I visible and audible now?
Yes. Welcome
Okay.
back.
All right.
Yes.
So this is only to remind all of us that there is a higher power before above all of us. That is, the power supply company which can at any point of time disconnect all of us with each other. So, all right. So getting back to where we were, yeah. So we were on the proviso to this section 10A that was added under the ordinance. So what the proviso say is that no application shall ever be filed for initiation of corporate insolvency resolution process of a corporate debtor for the said default occurring during the said period. Now, the said period would mean not only the 6-month period, but it could also be the extended period which is envisaged in the ordinance as such. So that means that if at all there is any default by a corporate debtor, at no point of time ever will a creditor be able to initiate insolvency resolution proceedings against the corporate debtor before the NCLT under the IBC. Now, this has been the point which has drawn the greatest criticism from people who have been in business, and especially people who have been managing funds on behalf of investors. This is something which is going to affect corporate funding to a huge extent in India. Just a couple of days back, I was talking to a client of mine who manages funds for HNIs, and then the sentiment which was captured was that all of these investors are wary of the fact that given this ordinance, it is going to be very easy for a corporate debtor to get away with defaults during this period, and during such extended period which may be there under the ordinance, if at all it gets extended as such. And therefore the risk which is associated in funding any company, be it a startup or be it a company which is doing very well and which is expanding its activities and needs liquidity for that, investors are wary in investing or putting their money in companies which have literally a license to default under this ordinance. And therefore, what is being seen is that many of these investors who are planning to invest in India the past few months, they have actually decided that forget about the 15%, 18%, even 20% returns that they were getting on the investment. If it is going to be a question mark on whether or not they'll have a recourse against a default which is committed by these people, then they'd rather invest in other places such as Singapore or even the US, where the liability of the company is not, or their debtor is not going to be curtailed at all. So they'd rather settle for a little bit lesser returns on their investment rather than no return at all of their investment in the first place. So this happens to be one of the most resounding criticisms that I keep hearing all the time. And this is in fact another criticism which probably needs to be taken note if at all this ordinance goes before the parliament in the form of a bill. Because otherwise what would happen is, let's say that this ordinance does not get sanctioned from the parliament, does not get passed, enacted as a bill itself. What would happen to all the defaults that have been committed during this period? Now, the law says that what is born of an ordinance will die with the ordinance as well. Now, essentially, this opportunity to default, if you can call it an opportunity to default, or if this discount which has been given to these companies to get away from the insolvency resolution process, this is essentially a creature of the ordinance itself. Let's say that the ordinance does not, the ordinance is allowed to die a natural death after the period once the session starts, and then it is not enacted into a law. The question that would arise is, for whatever defaults that were made by any corporate debtor during this period, will this section 10A still stand? Now, the answer to that question lies in a judgment of the Supreme Court, which was recently passed, where it said very clearly that the ordinance, whatever rights, whatever privileges have been created under an ordinance, cannot live beyond the ordinance. This is the case of Krishna Kumar Singh and another versus State of Bihar and others, where the Supreme Court has said very clearly that any privilege which has been created by way of an ordinance cannot survive the ordinance as such. So if that is the case, on one hand, you have a scenario where defaults which have been committed by a company, by a corporate debtor as such, there is a possibility that with the insertion of this section 10A and section 66 clause 3 being made permanent into the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code by way of enacting it in the form of an amendment act by the parliament, if at all they're made permanently a part of the IBC, then it means that there is absolutely no scope for any corporate creditor to initiate proceedings for corporate insolvency against these corporate debtors for these debts which have been for these defaults which have been committed during this period. On the other hand, if at all this ordinance does not get enacted in the form of a law and then it dies a natural death, it means that whatever defaults have been committed will suddenly become liable, the company will suddenly become liable to be sued before the NCLT under the IRP for all of these defaults which have been committed by the company as such. Now, this may or may not be within the knowledge of the company, because the general understanding of a common man of the law is that once an ordinance has been passed, once a particular position has been created in law, the common man or the company, they tend to think that that is a position which is permanent, and therefore there are always chances that they will try to make out an argument that it will amount to an estoppel in their favor. Although there is no estoppel against law, they will still try to make out a case that the ordinance provided for no for the non entertainment of any claims against the corporate debtor for any defaults which have been committed in this particular period. But then if the ordinance lapses and then they suddenly become liable to be sued before the NCLT, then they try to make out such a ground as such. Therefore, there are these ambiguities which have been brought about in this ordinance, which probably need to be dealt with in a better manner. Probably when this matter is taken up by a court, I'm actually surprised that there is no one who has actually challenged this ordinance before any court of law. Otherwise, these are ambiguities which actually strike at the root of the ordinance itself, and these are things that need to be dealt with very seriously. Otherwise, what would happen is where we are essentially looking at the future where there could be a large amount of defaults which have occurred, and then the corporate creditors would not be left with any recourse against them. And this itself will probably spiral into a situation where investment into the corporate sector or into even the MSME sector is also going to take a big hit. Now, when we talk about the MSME sector, that is another important aspect which has to be looked into, because the MSMEs, that is the micro, medium, small and micro industries, which are actually going to be hit very badly by this ordinance. Why? It's because of this. Let's say that there is a company which is into the business of manufacturing something. The company itself may not manufacture all the components of that particular product that it manufactures and sells. It may procure certain parts of or components of that particular product from various vendors. These various vendors could be different individuals, it could be proprietary concerns, or essentially they'd all be MSMEs, because there's a huge volume of MSMEs in the country. Probably if you look at volume, they're much more than the consolidated big corporate houses which are there. That is the volume of MSMEs that we have in our country. Now, let's say that these MSMEs supply certain components to these corporates, and then these companies default in payment of their dues on the basis of this ordinance, saying that they don't have to pay them because the ordinance says that it will not amount to a default. And then they tell them that if at all you want to recover these dues against me, you are welcome to go to the court. So what would the MSME or what would the individual do? Because if at all you have to go to the civil court and file a recovery suit, they'd have to pay a huge amount of court fees, which is not so if at all they initiate proceedings in the IBC. That itself is something which is going to hurt these small businesses, MSMEs, in a very huge manner. And what defaults are made by these companies, probably these companies will survive for a longer time because of this ordinance. But then this ordinance is only going to make these small businesses and these MSMEs and individuals who do these businesses suffer very badly because of this. They actually might end up shutting shop because of this particular ordinance. Of course, there's also the fact that the government has introduced schemes wherein the banks are encouraged to give more loans to MSMEs. But then a loan is a loan after all. A loan has to be repaid. A loan has to be repaid with interest as well. A loan essentially is a liability. So when there are dues to be paid to these MSMEs by companies which are just, rather than that, if they are made to take loans and pay interest on top of interest for repaying them as well, that would be highly unjust to these small players which are there in the market. And we are essentially going to kill this particular sector or make it very, very crippled in the next few months, only because of this, only because of the scope of this ordinance is so wide that it allows for defaults to happen left, right, and center. So this is another thing that should probably be considered at the point of time when this ordinance is taken up. When the amendment itself is taken up by the parliament for discussion, when it's getting passed, or if at all this ordinance itself gets challenged before the courts, appropriate courts of law, these probably would be valid considerations which would be taken into account while deciding the constitutionality and the validity of this particular ordinance. It's essentially something which is very ambiguous and vague and has a lot of gray areas which need to be addressed at the earliest, either by bringing in another ordinance or by narrowing the scope of the ordinance itself, and then specifying exactly what would be a default that would be linked to COVID, to any COVID related event, and then make the time frame itself very limited, under which the defaults which are occurring during the COVID period would not be taken, would not be liable to be taken up by the IRP, by the insolvency courts. So these are a few thoughts that I have about the ordinance as such. I think we can let others join in the discussion as well.
All right, Mr. Brijesh. Akash requests you to unmute all the viewers.
Yeah, analysts can unmute themselves and talk.
All right, can we have the first question? Can we have the first question?
Mute ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. Mute ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಎಂತಕ್ಕೆ?
Yes, sir. Rangarajan, sir. Yes.
Yes. Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Mr. Brijesh, good evening to you.
Good evening, sir.
I am Rangarajan, advocate.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions,
Yes, sir.
purely academic. First question is, this insolvency and bankruptcy code,
Yes, sir.
why it is not named as an act and why is it named as a code? Number one.
Okay.
Second question is very simple. While the code covers corporate entities, LLPs, etc., if an individual wants to initiate insolvency or bankruptcy proceedings against another individual, where does he go?
Okay. Yes, sir.
These are two questions.
All right. Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, so the first question is, why is it a code and not an act?
Yes.
Sir, yes, sir. Sir, essentially, this is called as a code because just like we have the other code, that is the Code of Civil Procedure, the Code of Criminal Procedure. This code itself is not a substantive law. It does not create any right in anyone's favor, or it does not create any liability in anyone's favor. It is merely procedural as such. It only provides for the procedure under which insolvency resolution process has to be carried out. Just like the CPC talks about how a civil court has to deal with civil claims, what are the different stages and how they have to deal with different matters as such. But the CPC itself does not create any substantive rights in favor of any of the parties as such. That is why this is called as a code, because the IBC itself is not a substantive piece of legislation. It does not create any right in favor of any person as such, and it is merely procedural in nature. That is why it's called as a code. So the second question that you asked, why can a individual file for initiate insolvency proceedings against another individual as such? The main objective behind passing the insolvency and bankruptcy code is they initially they just wanted to cover those aspects wherein commercial viability of those entities which essentially have an existence because of their commercial interest itself, only those are covered as such. When we look at individuals and when we look at the status of insolvency of individuals, there are rights which go beyond the commercial rights of that particular individual. Like when a person is declared as insolvent, there are many civil rights also which are associated with a person who is insolvent. The code itself may not be adequate to cover all these rights, and therefore it is left to the judicial system, which is there under the CPC, the Civil Procedure Code, the Civil Code, to look into the aspect of the insolvency of individuals as such, and not of entities. Because the IBC will mainly look into the rights of entities which are mostly of a commercial nature. There are only commercial interests involved in it. There are no other rights which are either destroyed or which are affected by an entity becoming insolvent as such, apart from their commercial rights. But then not so with an individual. I think that is why they have not included individuals also in the IBC, sir.
May I make one question?
Yes, sir.
Please. We had what is called as Provincial Insolvency Act.
Yeah.
At a time when there was not much of urbanization and industrialization and corporate entities were not thriving.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
the Provincial Insolvency Act has been repealed. Is it? Is it repealed?
Sir, I am aware that they were there in the 1908 and 1920. I think that point of time, that is when they were enacted. I am not aware of the status whether repealed or not. My guess is that probably having repealed because IBC is essentially an act which is there to consolidate all other acts with respect to insolvency concerning persons who have been defined and covered under the IBC.
Okay. Okay. I don't want to detain you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Mr. Gupta, sir. Yes.
Yes, sir. Hello, Brijesh. How are you?
Hello, sir. I'm good. How are you, sir?
Good, wonderful. Now, just now, our friend J. Rangarajan referred Provincial Insolvency Act,
Yes.
section 9 and 10. In all these insolvency matters, that's my experience.
Yes.
The beneficiary is only the official receiver or the liquidator. The real creditor will not get the benefit. What's your comment?
Sir, I think actually that is why they had to introduce the IBC, sir, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, because the old winding up proceedings that we used to have, where we used to file these petitions, winding up proceedings before the company court, that is the High Court. That point of time, there was a lot of discretion which was there in the hands of the liquidator. For everything, you'd have to go before the liquidator. In fact, sir, I'll give a very quick example without taking too much time. We had a matter wherein winding up was being initiated and then prosecuted against a particular company. Now, the company was not aware of it. It was placed ex parte and the order of the winding up was already passed and the liquidator had been appointed. When the company came to know about it, we filed an application and we went before the company court, before the High Court, and sought for the recalling of that order. And then we said that we will pay whatever dues are being claimed by the creditor. We are ready to pay for that as well. Now, what happened was, because of the time that takes for these matters to come up before the court, and for all the formalities which are there, that okay, on one date we will hear the liquidation, then we'll file the objections, and then we will have the hearing. These things which have happened, and for certain other clerical errors that also unfortunately happened in between, the time that was taken for recalling the order of winding up itself went into several months for no fault of either the company or the court itself. Eventually, what happened was the company was sent a fat bill for paying for the security of the premises of the company that almost came up to 1 lakh rupees. For these few months, when the money had not only been paid to the creditor, but the order of winding up had also been recalled, but only because of certain clerical errors, the winding up order could not be brought. The recalling of the winding up order could not be brought into effect as such. Because of this, there was a loss caused to the company for towards paying for the security agency, which was actually not allowing the company itself, the company managerial person themselves to step inside the company, despite them having paid all the dues. So this is one thing. This is one thing that was happening. Apart from that, the liquidator had a lot of discretion under the old Companies Act, under the winding up provisions. We all know how they used to, the manner in which claims would have to be adjudicated before the liquidator as such. Something that probably should have been a more of a judicial process was made something more of a bureaucratic process. And then the main thing was that the entire process was not conciliatory in nature, in the manner that if at all the company wanted to reconcile with all its creditors and then close the matter in a manner that the company would also continue to do its operations, and at the same time also clear all its dues in a phased manner, even to get to that stage, it would become extremely difficult. That is something the IBC tried to get over, and then tried to make the process very conciliatory by forming a committee of creditors who have a role in deciding how the company will go. Not only that, it also gave the opportunity for the directors of the companies themselves to make a proposal on how the debts of the company would have to be repaid, and how they will here onwards how they'll carry on the operations of the company as such. So leaving that much of opportunity for the directors of the company to try to take back control of the company and try to bring it back into existence and make it a profit-making entity again. Probably to that extent, the IBC is doing a good job, sir. But
if the company has assets, then it's all right. If the
Correct.
company has no assets, there is no problem. Yeah.
Yeah. If the company has no assets, then
Assets. Whether a suit or a liquidation proceedings, it makes no difference.
True, sir. That is why you have this section 66, subsection 2 in the IBC, wherein the IRP, Insolvency Resolution Professional, can actually compel the directors of the company to contribute to the assets of the company as such. If it comes to his knowledge that there's been any misfeasance of funds, or if at all they have derived any personal benefit, certain grounds are made out for them to actually be responsible for the liabilities of the company as such, he can certainly make them contribute. But then, yeah, there is always hope for improvement in any losses. This also by experience here also we have seen that there are companies which will actually not who will try to prolong the matter as far as possible, and they will not pay their dues unless unless the NCLT is on the verge of passing the order admitting this particular matter. It has gone to that stage many times. So we know that is how these companies work. But then, yeah, the constant reinvention is probably what is required, or constant improvement is what is required, I think, sir, for making this a better code.
Thank you, Mresh.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Can I come in, please? This is
Yes,
Sudarshan
sir.
here.
Yes, Mr.
Yes,
Sudarshan.
I have a question for Mr. Brijesh, and he was trying to answer Mr. Rangarajan's first question.
Yes, sir.
With regard to applicability of the IBC for individuals and partnerships.
Yes, sir.
though the code does make provision for liquidation of individuals and partnerships, but that is not yet notified, isn't it?
Yes, sir. They're not notified yet.
But nevertheless, you may have to really reconsider the fact that when you said that there are no substantive rights created. In fact, there are pretty substantive rights created, because a large part of the Companies Act has been repealed and the entire winding up process has been moved under the IBC,
Yes, sir.
isn't it?
Yeah, true, sir. It comes within the IBC. Yes.
Because there is no other option as such. And if you see chapter 3 and chapter 4, especially the chapters regarding the individuals, though it is specifically provided for the partnerships and LLPs, you go to the DRT, and for the individuals, you go to the which is designated district court or whatever that is there. But nevertheless, the section 241 really takes out repeals the provincial insolvency at all. I hope you had a chance to look at it.
Okay.
It does.
Yes, sir.
So now,
I can this.
Yes, sir.
Kindly permit me only 1 minute.
Yeah, please. Go
See,
ahead.
whenever a corporate entity ends up in winding up or liquidation or whatever, it results in very serious civil consequences. So we cannot say it does not create or does not take away a very valuable civil rights of a corporate entity. Therefore, obviously, perhaps it is called as a code not because it provides for procedure, but because excerpts have been taken from various legislations, consolidated, put in one book. That is why, but still, as my friend was suggesting, there are several measures under this code which results in substantial civil consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So can we have the next question? Looks like Mr. Venkatesh has a question.
Yes. So good evening, Mr. Brijesh.
Yes, sir.
Brijesh, you are saying about the fees, court fees and liquidator capacity, but here also the resolution professional is charging exorbitant fees and is also exercising his authority more than the liquidator himself.
True. So, yeah, what has happened is, what we have seen actually in some cases is that, first I'll talk about the fee aspect of it. So, when it comes to the fee aspect of it, although the fees are exorbitant, there is no doubt about it. What happens is, once there are a number of creditors who join the process, the fee gets distributed amongst all these creditors, whoever are involved in the process as such. Initially, the deposits that need to be made, that will have to be made by the person who has initiated the IRP process as such. But then over time, once the committee of creditors is formed, the fee that needs to be paid for everything gets distributed amongst all the creditors as such. Therefore, proportionally, if you look at the component, if you look at what the person would be paying as court fee in a civil court, that is something which is fixed and which cannot be changed at all. And unless the court orders for the costs of the litigation to be reimbursed to the litigant, there is probably no chance of it coming back unless, of course, there is a settlement before the evidence is commenced as such. But otherwise, what is once been paid as court fees at the beginning of the procedure itself, that is as good as gone. That is probably something which may not come back unless there are special circumstances. But then in insolvency resolution process, although the fees is exorbitant, it will get distributed amongst all the creditors. That is the committee of creditors which is formed, and then probably the burden is a little bit lesser. And moreover, what happens is, in most cases, we have seen that before the matter gets admitted, or when it is at the verge of admission, most of the companies agree to pay the dues as such. This is what we used to see even in winding up proceedings before the High Court. That
Yes.
when they see that the matter is getting admitted, they'll make a proposal. My lord, we will pay this much amount. Give us so much of time. That then there'd only be a prayer for time to be granted or the interest to be waived. Otherwise, they more or less agree on repayment of the dues as such. So a similar thing is happening in the NCLT as well. Once application for insolvency has been filed, it's only a matter of time before most of these corporate debtors come up to pay the dues as such. So those companies which actually go into this process as such, these are companies which have either completely lost their asset base and then there's no hope for them to continue their operations itself, or these are companies, a lot of these companies are those which are involved in especially in these real estate scams. You'll see that most of these companies, I think couple of years back or maybe 3-4 years back also, there was this company called as Dreams Infra which came up, and then they were offering flats for a very low rate. So all companies like these go into liquidation. This is where actually, because they probably have diverted all the money that have taken as deposit from their customers, and then it becomes difficult for them to for anyone to recover this amount on their own. And then once the IRP is appointed in these matters, then the fees also gets distributed and the assets are also liquidated and distributed amongst the creditors of the company.
Brijesh, Mr. Brijesh, I want to interrupt. With respect to Dreams Infra, which you referred, in that particular case, the professional fee is fixed at 6.25 lakh per month plus success fee. Plus, which is the money which the professional, this resolution professional is making is 6.25 lakhs per month plus success fee.
Yes, sir.
That's what I'm trying to say. That it is true.
Yes, sir. That's true, sir. This is something that will have to be looked into, and I think this is something that all the bar will actually have to pass a resolution or make a collective representation before the concerned authorities, before the NCLT, probably to regulate the fees that are being charged by the IRPs for this, sir.
Mr. Raghunath sir has to look into this issue, sir. Please, this Raghunath sir, please look into these issues.
Yes, 100% I look into it. Yes, Venkatesh sir, now 100% we look into it.
Please notice, sir, ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಪಟ್ಟೆ charge ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, exorbitant charges ಅದು.
ಇಲ್ಲ ಅದು ರೆಸಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಪಾಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕನ್ಸರ್ನ್ ಮೀಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅದು ಮಾಡೋಣ ಸರ್.
ಆಕಾಶ್ ಗುಪ್ತಾ ಸರ್ ಏನೋ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. He wants to convey something. ಆಕಾಶ್
ಸರ್ ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಗುಪ್ತಾ
ಸರ್, ನೀವು ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಗುಪ್ತಾ ಸರ್.
Sir, my learned friend Mr. Venkatesh was referring a success fee. What is success fee? For the first time hearing that.
Sir, success fee andre if at all, like the name says, if at all there is a recovery andre, the percentage of that has to be given to the IRP anta. That is what is there called as a success fee. These are matters actually which we have to collectively voice against, because one is like Venkatesh sir said, the exorbitant fee which is charged by the IRP, it actually plays to his advantage if he delays the process as such, because he keeps getting paid every month. That is from the pocket of the creditors itself and from the assets of the company. So and on top of that, it also take a success fee. So I think like Venkatesh sir said, and I'll also request Rangnath sir, that we have to pass a resolution against this and ensure that the bar takes up this matter before the concerned authorities, and then at least brings down the cost of insolvency resolution, sir.
All right. Thank you. So can we have the next question? Can we have the next question, please? Akash, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. I think panelists have to unmute themselves and talk.
Do we have any more questions to go? I think that's about it. No response. Let me just have a quick look at the Q&A box if we have any questions. No, we don't have any questions.
Okay.
I think that's about it. Mr. Brijesh, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for educating us.
My pleasure.
Thank you once again on behalf of Advocates Association Bangalore.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, a heartful thanks to the association for giving me the opportunity to present my views on this topic. And I think, like Mr. Venkatesh and Mr. Gupta suggested, the two matters which have actually come to our, which have been echoed during this discussion is that something has to be done about the exorbitant fees that is being charged by the IRPs, and also on the issue of the success fee as such. Now, it is a fact that as advocates, ethically, we can't charge anything called as a success fee, right? So that is not there. So insolvency professional also, since he discharges duties which have been given to him by the court as such, it is probably not ethically correct on his part as well to charge this thing called as a success fee. I think these matters should be taken up by our association.
Definitely, sir has already agreed, so we will try to work it offline. So
Sure,
it's a good thing that out of this session, something very important has been brought to the notice of the association. So we will definitely try to work it out offline. All right. Thank you so much. With your consent, Mr. Brijesh, we'll be logging off the session. Thank you once again.
Certainly, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.